Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grabner. With us is University of Missouri, Scott Brand. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Another up and down week when it comes to market. So to get things started today, let's recap what happened.
Yeah, if we start with cash fed cattle this week that were basically unchanged. Looking at feeder cattle sales this week, they were steady to $3 higher. On the future side of cattle, we saw the June live cattle futures contract up 85 cents, with the May feeder cattle futures contract up 50 cents. The choice box beef price gained this week up $2.25 on strength on ribs and loins this week. On the hog side, barrow and gilt prices were $1.25 higher this week, while that May lean hog futures contract closed down nearly $2 for the week. The pork cutout value was also higher this week, up $2.65. That now puts that pork cutout value $18 above where we were a year ago at this time. A lot of strength in things like bellies this week helped on the pork cutout value.
Scott, we've talked a lot about the fact that with this whole African swine fever situation in China and the fact that they're going to have to turn somewhere for more protein has really or could potentially push our markets up and down the hog side of things. We've really seen a lot of that in the last 2 to 3 weeks. Big jumps higher and some steps back and kind of moving around that way. Is this just more of what we can anticipate for the not so distant future?
I sure think so. I mean, again, it's the battle of what's going to be larger domestic supplies against what could be some potentially strong demand for pork as Chinese pork production declines. So I think we're going to continue to see that battle. When you look at what happened this week, we saw at least a little bit of convergence between where we've been on cash and in futures markets as we got a little bit of a slowdown on the futures side and a little bit of catch up on the cash side. So I think that volatility is going to stay with us for the foreseeable future.
All right, let's talk a little domestic issues. Let's start first with retail prices this week. We came into this. What are some things that we're seeing and what did that report show?
Yeah, that's number one. We got a really good boost in both beef and pork prices, retail prices for March. The choice beef retail price was about 17 cents higher than where we were in February, while the pork retail price moved 7 cents higher on March relative to February. So some really nice gains, and I think it continues to point to what is demand that's really held strong as we think about the supplies of beef and pork that we're putting on the domestic market today.
Does our consumer confidence play into that kind of tie in together as well?
Yeah, I think so. When you look at the consumer confidence report that we got out, that index came in April. It was down 1.5% in total, but when you look at the makeup of that, the current economic situation, that index was up 0.8%. So you can tell there's a lot more concern about what's going to happen going forward than where we sit today. And I think that corresponds to what were some higher retail prices we got out of the report this week as well.
So right now, folks are feeling pretty confident about the situation economically as we take a look at things.
I think so, and I think they continue just to look at some of the potential concern as we see some signs the economy is slowing down in the country, and I think that has a lot to do with that index of consumer expectations.
Scott, also out this week, USDA's latest supply and demand report. As we take a look at those numbers, were we surprised to see some changes on the livestock side of things?
No, so really not surprised, Megan. As we've seen hog prices that have moved higher. USDA in their April report did increase the range or the midpoint of their range for hog prices in 2019 by $4. I think much of that's a result of the uncertainty with ASF in China. When you look at the rest of the livestock S&Us that we see, probably not a lot of change relative to where we've been. But just trying to catch up, I think, with what's been some higher cash hog prices, again, the last several weeks.
China is really going to dominate our conversation today. The Foreign Ag Service released their World Markets and Trade Report also this week, and China's at the front and center of those talks and projections as well.
That's right. We get lots of folks weighing in on where they think Chinese pork production will be for 2019. It's nice. USDA's actually released their twice a year circular on livestock and poultry outlook. They now suggest for 2019 that Chinese pork production will have declined by a little more than 10% in that report. So starting to get some signs from some others about what's happening in terms of Chinese pork production. They do suggest Chinese consumption of pork will also be lower this year, down 8.8%. So I think that starts to give us some indication as well that some expect the Chinese are going to eat less pork as a result of what's going on with African swine fever.
If they're going to eat less pork, will they consume other proteins?
Absolutely. If you look at what USDA is saying in that circular, a couple of things stuck out to me. Number one, if you look at beef imports into China, 213,000 metric tons higher is the projection for 2019 relative to 2018. The U.S. gets a little bit of that growth, not much. Even chicken imports into China up 233,000 metric tons. Again, the U.S. gets a little bit of that market, but not very much. But we also don't want to forget that imports of pork into China are also expected to be higher, according to USDA. They actually pegged total Chinese pork imports at 2.2 million metric tons for 2019. If that happens, that will be a record in terms of imports of pork into China. We continue to have that conversation about who gets those imports. If you look at USDA's data, it tells me they're suggesting that the European Union gets about half of the total growth in 2019, and the U.S. would get a growth of somewhere around 140,000 metric tons of additional pork going into China. That's important and certainly could boost U.S. prices higher.
And I would assume if more of the EU pork is going into China, that means there's opportunity for more U.S. pork to go into markets that the EU had been servicing and had preferential treatment to before?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think the U.S. Trade path could grow more than what just goes to China as a result of taking over some of those markets and maybe it's both the EU as well as Brazil. USDA is showing Brazil pork imports 170,000 metric tons higher as well. So there will be some other trade opportunities as the EU and Brazil take the lion's share of that Chinese growth potentially.
Scott, as we wrap up today, taking a look at food to have on hand here in the U.S.
There was an increase in the profitability for hogs in March to $8.47 a head. That was the first profitable month since July of last year. So we're seeing some better news, I guess, on the pork side in terms of producer profitability.
Does that, I know we talk about the glut and the record amount and the supply of hogs on hand, but if we're seeing an increase in profitability, does that also mean we could potentially not see expansion slow or see expansion increase again?
Yes, I think you're correct in that if we continue with several months here in a row of increased profitability, I think we could see expansion. Now, maybe that rate of expansion slows a little bit, but certainly profitability will not be a hindrance to what would otherwise be growth. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but we could continue to see pork production expand and maybe even to the point where some of these labor issues that we continue to talk about and some of the new processing capacity that we have online become more and more of an issue in front of us.
All right, Scott, looking ahead to next week, what reports are we watching for from USDA?
Yes, we'll have a little bit of early into next week with Friday being Good Friday. But we get cattle on feed and monthly trade data out on Thursday. So a little more information on what's going on the cattle side of the equation, as well as getting some good information about what's been happening on the monthly trade front.
And we will talk to you next Thursday as well.
Very good, Megan.
Have a good weekend. For our weekly livestock market update, for all the latest in market news, you can visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can submit questions and comments to Scott and I as well. And subscribe to our weekly livestock market update to be delivered to your email box every Saturday morning. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.